folks. This is Wiley Oakley, roaming man of the Great Smoky Mountains. I have now different kinds of stories to tell.
Hi, my name is Gwinn, and I've been doing stories at Wilderness Wildlife for several years. I am currently a guide in the National Park.
All right, well, I'm going to start right away about Wiley Oakley. And I know that most of you are very familiar with him, but just in case I have one or two here that are not, I'm going to take just a minute here to really look at who Wiley Oakley was. We all know that in the most basic general way, he was the most famous guide in the Smokies in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and early 50s. And he would guide the politicians, the dignitaries. He'd guide newspapermen like Ernie Pyle. He would guide the likes of businessmen such as Henry Ford and the Firestones, and had a national reputation. In fact, he became known as the Will Rogers of the Smokies. But the vast majority of people here would have called him the Roman man of the mountains, because that is what he simply called himself, Mr. Roman, because he loved these mountains and Roman in them. But you know, Wiley, he sort of said, I like the idea that I have a couple names. That way, if I ever get in trouble, I can blame it on the other fella. And so that was just sort of how Wiley was. But I want to look at some things that happened in Wiley's life that would forever affect him and impact his character. And a lot of these are some early things on. And so just to give you a little somewhat of a biographical information about him and his family. Wiley was the youngest of 8 children. He was born at the foot of Mount LeConte. And he said, being the youngest, just as I had to work my way up the mountain, I had to work my way up the family. That's what happens, he said, when you're the leaston or the youngest. Well, his father, Harvey Oakley, had come from Scotland when he was a very, very young boy. And at the age of 11, Henry and his parents would move to Knoxville, Tennessee. And then when he was about 15, 16 years old, Harvey Oakley and his parents moved here to the mountains. And, you know, he came to love these mountains. But this is where Wiley's father would fall in love with a young girl by the name of Elmina Connor. And she was a good part Cherokee. And Henry would stay the rest of his life in these mountains. Well, in 1885 is when Henry and Elmina's next 8th child would be born, by the name of Wiley Oakley. Henry Oakley loved the mountains, and he instilled that in his son Wiley. But also, he needed these mountains. He loved hunting, he loved the outdoors, but he needed them also, because this is the way he would provide for his family. He loved to bear hunt, but he had to bear hunt, because this is how he'd put food on the table. But he'd instill this love for the outdoors and for nature. And something else about Pat Oakley, as his grandchildren called him, said that each night Pat would call us all around by the fireplace. And Pat had an organ, and he would start to play hymns, and he'd always end them with Near My God to Thee. That was a favorite song. And then he'd sit down and he'd read the Bible to us, and he'd have prayer. And that would be something he would consistently give his children and his grandchildren. But what's going to happen when Wiley is still a very, very young boy? His mother dies in childbirth. And so one of his oldest brothers, his wife, is going to try to do the very, very best she can to actually raise Wiley. And many of the stories I'm going to tell are from Wiley's book, Resting in Roman, from his son Harvey's book, Remembering the Roman Man of the Mountains, and from Lucinda's book. She was the queen of the Smokies. One of Wiley's saddest stories in his book I want to share, and I'm going to just read it as Wiley wrote it. Wiley wrote, "All my people say Mother has died, and she's been placed under the sod. What a strange story to tell a young boy. I began to wonder at all these things, and I thought, I must find her. I must find what has really happened to her. I notice other boys of my size, that they have a mother and she is so kind to them. I wanted a mother that I could love and be cared for. On Saturday nights, all my playmates, their mothers tell them that they have to come in and clean up for Sunday. And she goes and she hunts up clean garments. And she says, boys, get busy, for tomorrow is the Sabbath. It's the Lord's Day, and you must be clean. Then I go back home, and there is no mother. And I think, why is it that I can't have a mother like this? So I will go into the mountains. I will search the woods far and wide, because my mother must be lost. She must be somewhere in these mountains. I must look among all the rocks, whether they be great or small. I will look very, very close for a lady's footprint in the soft earth." Later on, he writes, "I failed to find a footprint after looking for Mama day after day. So then I decided to climb some of the highest peaks of the Smokies to look down on the valley to see if I could find her. Each time I would climb to a high peak, I'd see another peak higher than where I was. So I had to climb that mountain too, always looking, always searching, always wondering for my mother. All my hunting was in vain. Someday in the future, I must find out more about this saying, what people mean when they say people have to die. So you see, as a young boy, how being out in the woods, the mountains, the trees, was a great source of pain and suffering. He'd lay on the ground and he'd look up at the clouds and he'd say, Mother, are you somewhere up there? Are you looking down? Are you looking for me, your son, Wiley? It was very difficult for him. But understanding his need and being very compassionate, his father said, Wiley, why don't you start coming with me as I go making trips in the mountains, as I go hunting? I'd love to have you come along. And you know, there was this slow transition, and Wiley began to find comfort, and then peace, and eventually Wiley would come to the point in his life where he found great joy and happiness in God in these mountains. And so you see this complete turnaround. So that was a very, very early influence and impact upon him. But I want to go ahead now to his young years as a boy and courting and marrying. As a young boy, Wiley said there were only 3 things that he actually owned. He had his own gun, his own dog, and a lantern. And Wiley said at the age of 19, if I only had a wife, that would be all I would ever need to make me happy for all the rest of my days. If I had these 4 things, I would never ever have need of anything more. And then he married, and then he wrote in Roman and Reston. But after I got married, I found out I needed everything else but a wife. But it was too late to recall. So he would be about 20, and his 15-year-old golden-haired bride, Rebecca Ann Ogle, would marry. And you know, this was common back then. His father, he said, you know, we're going to have a wedding, so we're going to kill a hen and the old red rooster. And we're going to have chicken and dumplings and all the fixings and stacked cake. And people came from near and far. And he said it was quite a day, because that is the day that my father presented me with a pole axe and a saw. And as soon as we married, I got to sawing and to chopping, because I knew everything in our cabin on scratch britches I was going to have to build. Money was very, very scarce. And of course, he had absolutely no money to get his beautiful bride a wedding ring. So being resourceful, he just soldered up a dime. And that became Rebecca's wedding band. And so, very resourceful. But you know, they would live the first 4 years at scratch britches, and they survived, he says, on scratch biscuits. But it was called scratch britches because there were so many briars and thorns, you always had to worry about tearing up your britches. All right. Well, sorry about that. Well, Wiley, you know, when they were first married, Rebecca Ann knew that it was 2 miles to the nearest neighbor, and he wanted to go hunting during the night. And she said, Wiley, I'm not going to let you go unless you do something for me. You see that front door? You've got to put a lock or 2 on it. You've got to put a couple bolts. You've got to put some latches. You've got to put some pins, and you've got to put some pegs. And if you get it all locked good, then I'm going to let you go hunting. And so that's what Wiley did. And he and his good friend Grady, they'd go out at night, they would take their bloodhounds, and they'd go hunting in these woods. But you know, one day, Grady said to him, Wiley, I've looked at your hog rifle, and I cannot believe that you can get a thing with this rifle because it's so crooked. I mean, how is it possible you can go hunting with it? And he said, Grady, don't be talking bad about my hog rifle. You don't understand. I know it's got a crooked barrel, but it's the best gun I have for shooting around trees. That's the kind of guy that Wiley was. Well, you know, they loved it at I can't say scratch britches and scratch biscuits together, but they loved it there. And they would have stayed for many more years, except for the problem that rattlesnakes moved in. And they moved in a very, very big way. And with all their youngins, they didn't think it was too safe. So Wiley says, when they moved in, we turned the cabin over to the snakes. And we moved out. And they would go live with his father for a couple years, and then they would go to Bullhead, all right, by the foot of Mount Lacan. Now, I want to, bless your heart, thank you. Okay, the quality. And he's also smart. Because on the way over here, what did you say to me? Do you think you need any water? And I said, no, I never use water for drink. We go, I said, I don't. He knew. All right, sorry. Anyway, some of the qualities of Wiley Oakley, he really was a very true mountain man. He loved these mountains, and he really did live off the land. By collecting ginseng, he would collect ramps, he would do trapping, he'd do fishing, he'd do hunting, but also in the form of guide service. He would actually live off the land. And he always said, I feel very, very guilty for getting any money for doing this, okay? Because I love these mountains so much, and whether I had anybody to take hiking with me or not, I'd be out here and I'd be roaming in these mountains. But he said, if you want to pay me something for doing it, that's okay. And what was pretty phenomenal, when you think about it in the 30s and 40s, probably one of the biggest tips that Wiley was known to have ever gotten was about $500. So for back then, that was pretty good. I mean, I'm still waiting for one like that. But anyway, so Wiley put it this way. He says, I'll have a plan. You know, as long as I can be a guide in these mountains, he said, I'll have my tourists in the summer, and I got taters in the winter. And so between the two of those, I can get by. You know, Wiley never ever lost his wonder for these mountains. He always stayed very, very true and humble to his roots. And people love to hear Wiley talk. And I could never put things the way he did, just naturally, and I don't have his accent, but they were listening for that accent and for the way, that homespun philosophy and the way he put things. Now, being a very, very good friend of Henry and Clara Ford, in fact, one of Wiley's daughters was named after Mrs. Ford. You know, Henry Ford said to Wiley one day, he says, I want to take you up to Detroit. Now, to Wiley, Detroit was known as the outside world. He says, I don't think so. He said, yes, I want to give you a radio show. I can make this happen. You can have your own radio show. You'll earn a lot of money. People will love you. He said, no, I won't have any of it because, one, I'm not going to leave my mountains, and second, chances are, if I became big and famous and wealthy, my hat wouldn't fit anymore. And I'll just as soon stay in these mountains. But you know, also, then later on, in the early 50s, he died in 1954, but there was a station out of Atlanta, Georgia, who had heard of the Roman Man in the Mountains, and they sent their TV crew here. And they took all different kinds of stories and pictures, and he went home to tell Mrs. Rome and his wife about it. He said, I was in the park today, and he said they shot me all to pieces with something called canaries. And he said, I figured that when I see my picture on that thing they're calling it television, I'm going to be the best looking monkey in the Smokies. So he never really took himself too seriously. But, so he is a homespun philosopher. Now, many of you know Wiley never went to a day's look of school. He taught himself how to read and write. But what's so amazing, and I love this, Wiley was a student till the day he died. He studied people. He studied animals. He studied all the trees. He studied the plants, the rivers, the sky, the clouds, the trees, the trails. Life was a school for him. And every day he was learning something brand new. Well, what's going to happen after guiding so many people in all his adventures? They kept saying to him, Wiley, please, please, would you not put all your stories together and compile a book? And he said, well, I would, if I'd ever been to school and I knew how to write. They said, well, just do it anyway. He said, okay, I'm going to spell it as I talk it. And that's exactly what he did. And so in the front of his book, Roman and Reston, it's going to tell you, he said, now I know people who go to school, they're aware of something, they know of something called a colon and a semicolon. I won't be using these in my book. All I'm going to have is a dot. And that dot means just slow down, catch your breath, and then keep going. But his book did very, very well. Do you know, homespun philosophy. When somebody new had made a bad mistake, he went up to him and he said, I'm going to tell you this. He said, I've made mistakes too, so we'll fall in the ditch together. Be aware and think about making decisions, but Wiley would put it this way. He says, take a peek over the fence, and if you see no good to jump it, then just stay put. Wiley told people that when the stork delivered him, he had lost all his clothes along the way. Wiley didn't swear. He said swearing is a very, very bad habit, and it's catching, so don't start it. He said, when I was a small boy, if my daddy had heard a bad word come out of me, I got my back tanned so hard with a limb. I was not to ever swear, to chew, or smoke. He says, but one time I do remember going over the mountain, and I did try chewing. But I never ever did it again because I got so sick. He said, I thought the thing to do was to chew it and swallow, chew it and swallow, chew it and swallow. He said, I got sicker and sicker because the whole time it was backfiring on me. He said, I thought I was about to die, so I don't chew. And he said, I don't do Sean either, except if I got a chigger bite. Then I'll put them on the chiggers and they get so drunk they jump right off. Now one day, one tourist came up to Wiley and she said, Wiley, you have been exploring these mountains for years and years, and I was just wondering, surely, there has been a time or two that you've gotten lost. He said, no, never been lost. There has been a time when I was horribly bothered for several days, but never lost. He said, but I do know a man, an older man. Now, when they found him, there was nothing left but the bones. He was lost. He said, I've never been lost. Okay. And he would often brag, because you have to remember, he had a guide service, and then on the north end of Gatlinburg, where you have those log buildings, was Wiley's shop, and his wife had a little craft shop. Later on, they'd have entertainment in the evenings every night, but not Sunday night. Okay? And so, because he'd have these adventures during the day, he'd have all kinds of things to tell people at night if they'd come to listen to his son and their band. And so he was telling a group that came that night, he said, you know, Mrs. Roman and I, we were up at the chimneys this afternoon and we had a picnic, and today alone we happened to spot 4.5 bear. And everybody started chuckling and they sort of looked. Finally a lady came up to me afterwards and she said, well, I gotta ask you something. You said 4.5 bear. Tell me how that's possible. He said, well, we saw 4 whole bear, and then I saw half of one's back sticking out of the garbage can. Just the back end. That was a half bear. He was a very, very keen observer of physical and human nature, especially the changing of the seasons. You see, even before this area became a national park in 1934, we had the American Natural History Museum coming here, And we also had many people, scientists, botanists, geologists, from the Smithsonian Institute. And they believed when it come to knowing the flora and the fauna of the Smokies, there was none better than the Roman man of the mountains. And he had such a great knowledge of the trees and the plants. Well, we have over 5,000 here. So that's a lot to know. But if you ever see a doll's eye or a heart's a-bustin' with love, these were just a couple of the plants that were named by Wiley Oakley. But this is what his son writes of him, Harvey, in the book Remembering. He says he knew the call of the songbirds, as well as the singing of the rattlers, the whispers of the wind, the whistling of the trees, and the gurgles of the streams. And I said he was a keen observer of nature. He would be so aware of the changes in the seasons, and all the sounds, the sights, the smells. I can't imagine what it would have been like to have walked the trails in these mountains with Wiley Oakley. But this is something in his book also said. The flowers is blooming, and today I hear the spring birds singing. I see the honeybees buzzing. Everything is changing so fast. Just last week, the frogs were silent, but today they are very, very much alive. I must now bring my story to a close. I do know that God knows the whole story, and God is so kind. And today, He is just waiting for a little whisper from the Roman man of the mountains to say, I'm sorry, God, sorry that I don't thank you more often, both day and night, for all I've done. And you see, when Wiley would finish up a little walk, or maybe he'd just go outside for a few minutes and look at the birds and the trees, he'd always write maybe just a sentence or two, and he'd give a little title and put the day, and it was just sentences. There might be one paragraph, just an idea, but he just wanted it to be so fresh and so close after he just experienced it. And so that's why he'd have just these little short excerpts like, okay, another time he was walking, and this is going to be in the fall.
Wiley Oakley